What's up, guys? This one's for those pot smokers in the house. What's up? Why? Because we're moving on to Jordan's story, which is chapter 16 of the second part of Refuge Recovery, where we are reflecting on recovery. The following are personal recovery stories from members of our Refuge Recovery community. We have included these stories for those new to recovery to get a sense of the various ways in which recovery happens. You are not alone in your suffering, your confusion, or your path of healing and recovery. This is Jordan's story. As I walked down the alley near my mother's house, I noticed a feeling of confidence that I hadn't felt in years. I was oddly aware that the sense of pride was because I was holding the pot. I felt wanted, and it felt great. My friends watched with anticipation as I loaded the pipe and took the first hit. The warm smoke filled my lungs and exploded out, leaving me coughing as I'd never coughed before. A feeling of gushy happiness filled my body as I closed my eyes and thanked the universe for showing me this magical plant. And at that very moment, I vowed to do whatever necessary to feel this way for the rest of my life. My earliest memories are happy. My parents showered me with love, attention, and affection. Lucky. They had suffered through 3 miscarriages and were told they would never conceive. So when I was born, I inherited all the yearning and longing they had had in their hearts. Not to imply that this would discount the infinite love and joy they would have for the 2 miracle pregnancies to come. I think I might have been the happiest little boy in the history of little boys. I would spend hours crawling on my mother's bed, curling under the covers as she read me a book. At 4 years old, I was given a daily afternoon bath, courtesy of my paternal grandmother, who came to stay at my house and help babysit me while my mother was on bed rest for the last 4 months of her second pregnancy. The water was always the perfect temperature, not too hot and not too cold, as I held my tiny plastic model airplanes and swirled them through the air and then turned them into submarines. I'm told that around that time, I was very curious about God and mesmerized by the idea that my mom's big fat belly had a person in it. It was not uncommon for me to exclaim, "Geez, isn't God so great?" Then ask, "Why does God make some people homeless?" Elementary school would prove to instill more questions. It was during this time when I first noticed that I didn't have control over my body. This body, the one I thought I could control, would rule me. At times it would twitch or jerk. Sometimes it would expel strange noises from my mouth. These movements were involuntary. Like a sneeze, I couldn't help it. I was soon diagnosed with Tourette Syndrome, a neurological disorder that makes the brain misfire and send random motor and vocal impulses. The kids at my school were kind enough not to laugh in my face when I would suddenly jerk my neck to the side or randomly let out a little yelp. They did their best to hide their jokes, but I always knew. I felt like embarrassment incarnate. I was convinced I was broken, that I was inherently defective. It was around this time, or 10 or 11 years old, that I had my first drink. A school friend's parents were throwing a big party at their house, and the kids were allowed to set up a tent and spend the night having adventures in the backyard. Looking around, I saw 3 distinct cliques: the adults, the older kids, and me and my friends. I couldn't have cared less about the adults, and I loved my friends, but there was something about those older kids. They all seemed like they were in the midst of the best night of their lives. A few of them were even smoking cigarettes. I thought only adults were allowed to do that. A couple hours into the night, one of my friends said we should go try a sip of alcohol. I had remembered that my dad would sometimes pour a few different liquids into some glass when he drank alcohol. So naturally, we poured a little bit of whatever kind of booze there was around the bar into an empty aluminum can of Coke. Ironically enough, the very first time I drank anything with Emily Lynn Hoxer, still remember. We were watching Men at Work, a silly movie with Estevez and Charlie, and we did just that because we didn't want her dad to know, so we literally took a little bit from each bottle, vomited profusely, got the spins like crazy. I think that's probably one of the reasons why I've only ever gotten drunk like 8 or 9 times in my life. But back to the book and Jordan here. Back in the tent, we each took turns taking a swig of the concoction, the most vile mixture of gin, rum, red wine, beer, and vodka. We all had that same initial reaction. Our faces cringed. I'm cringing just thinking about it, as we trembled with disgust. But pushing past the wretched taste and sensation of my throat being on fire, I knew I had just experienced a sliver of something great. Unlike the others, I drank as much of the gross fire water as I could before throwing up and surrendering to bed. With puberty in full swing, middle school was not particularly fun. Social status was a new and difficult concept. I suddenly had to impress girls. And that was all on top of being the kid in the back of the classroom who during exam time would spontaneously rupture silence with noises that would have been ejected from Chewbacca's very own mouth. My self-esteem took a beating with every tick I talked. And though I had a good group of friends, some of whom I'm thankfully still close with, I would have done anything to crawl into a hole and never come out. By 12, this feeling of isolation, which had previously been confined to school grounds, had started to spread. I began to feel lonely at home as well. My father had recently landed the job of his dreams, which unfortunately took up more and more of his time. The lack of his presence at home became impossible to ignore. Even when he was home, it seemed like he was on the phone the majority of the time. I came to the conclusion that if I were important to my father, he'd act differently. That walk down the alley with Pot, my newly discovered savior, couldn't have come at a better time. I honored the vow I made, got high at every opportunity, and became very skilled at creating an abundance of those opportunities. No one on earth could tell me to put down this thing that turned my bad feelings into good ones. I now had a sense of identity and interminable access to the vacation I had so hungered for. Time off from the turmoil going on at home, and most importantly, a break from my mind. And God knows I've needed it for the random Wednesday evening my parents sat my brother and me down saying they had something they wanted to talk to us about. Sensing something ominous was about to present itself, I sat down with a knot in my throat. It was clear they were nervous too, which only exasperated my fear. They told us that they were getting a divorce and that my dad was moving out. At some point in the conversation, there was mention of God. He had a plan for everyone, someone said, so there's no need to worry. That felt like a ultimate betrayal. That there's a plan and everything's going to turn out all right? Why then something bad happens and I'm told God works in mysterious ways? How can people be so stupid to mistake meanness for a mystery? I sat there listening to the two people whom I once viewed as all-knowing, perfect beings. I still can't find the words to fully express the mixture of sadness, anger, betrayal, and disillusionment that I felt. It was as if everything I'd ever been told was a complete and utter lie. There was no happy endings. There was no happily ever after. Shortly after my dad moved out, I had my first blackout. My dad took my brothers and me to our cousin's house for dinner. I was pestering my dad to let me taste the wine that he had on the other adults were drinking. He inevitably caved and poured a tiny splash into a cup. After that, I have a fuzzy memory of sneaking into the basement of my cousin's house to steal a bottle of wine. That's where my recollection of that night ends. I woke up the next day very late in the afternoon with a massive headache, which I thought was very odd. I yelled out for my cousin James, who was supposed to have spent the night, James was nowhere to be found. Instead, my dad appeared with a look of immense fear. I asked where James was. "Don't you remember the long talk we had?" my dad responded. "Because you were acting out and insulting me, you lost the privilege to have James sleep over." I sat still, racking my brain, so confused as to why I had absolutely no clue about the intense encounter that my dad had recounted. I must have looked like a deer in the headlights. With comedic timing, I lunged forward and threw up. The parallel timing of my declining personal life and my launch into drugs and alcohol was never lost to me. Whether I was willing to openly admit this or not, I knew my using was a symptom of deep emotional and spiritual wounds and confusion. I concluded that the heartbreak of caring was too much, and if I ever invested in another or let anyone else in close enough, I would be safe. It became instinctual for me to distance myself from anyone or anything I thought would break my heart. This philosophy turned out to only create feelings of loneliness, futility, and a core belief that I was unworthy. My using quickly progressed, and I became more and more apathetic towards the world. What might be considered social using, quote unquote, was over. I would always observe people's attitudes towards getting high, and without exception acknowledge that I had a different relationship to drugs and alcohol. I wanted and needed them. I was on the edge and about to jump into the self-imposed prison of hopelessness. My grades dropped lower than they had ever been, and I was soon kicked out of my first high school when the principal came across a little bong I kept in my locker. Drained from dealing with the turmoil in their lives, my parents were easy prey. I had become an expert in knowing what heartstrings to pull and when. Getting kicked out of school was a surprisingly painless ordeal. I didn't even get grounded. My parents wanted so badly to trust me. It's amazing what people will believe based on their desire for it to be true. Touché. You find what you look for. My new school was a haven for getting high. I ran into friends whom I knew from parties. The atmosphere reminded me of a burglar going back to jail and reuniting with all of their burglar friends. These guys were just like me. We were the people at the party whose sole mission was to drink as much as we could and get as high as possible. The day I started the new school, I took a few Vicodins. By now, this was very normal, if not necessary. I was a miserable person to be around if I didn't get something in my system each morning. That day during lunch, these friends took me to an abandoned school bus where we smoked pot, watching the teachers and students walk across campus. In the same way two gifted athletes competing against each other will raise the level of play, these friends and I pushed each other to new levels of consumption. I tried to do well in school. I was a great starter. I could begin a project or start a new chapter in my life, quote unquote, with very real intentions of straightening up my act. It was always different this time, quote unquote, and I sincerely cared. The problem was that I had lost all tolerance for discomfort. The moment a feeling or thought that wasn't wanted crept in, I was off chasing a high. Life was either running to drugs or running away from pain. It was a constant battle to, quote, keep it together, end quote. When I enjoyed getting high, I couldn't control it. When I tried to control getting high, I couldn't enjoy it. In hopes of getting me sober, my parents sent me to a therapist who introduced me to meditation. I took to meditation from the start. The concentration practice I was taught provided me with a sense of calm, reminiscent of the first time I got high. But the feeling never stayed too long, and there was no way meditation was going to be able to compete with my active addiction. I wanted my mom not to worry about me so much. Yet time and again, I would claim change only to disappoint. Rather than engage in arguments and yell, my mother carried the faint air of surrender in the face of my bullshit. Rather than to raise her voice, she would simply say, "I'm disappointed in you." The sadness in her eyes when she looked at me was unbearable. I put on the mask of anger and puffed my chest to tell the world I didn't care. But that was a lie. I just could not deal with how overwhelming caring could be. There was certain drugs that I saw as the bad drugs that I never let my circle of friends know I used. I did them either with my dealer or by myself. Even though my close friends were doing a lot of these drugs, I had such a deluded, shame-filled perception that I thought if they saw me using those drugs, they would think I was scum. It was self-obsession and egocentricity to epic proportions. I was the piece of shit that the world revolved around. It's comical that I hated myself so much when all I thought about and cared about was me. The last year of my drinking and drugging was a downward spiral. I lived in constant state of desperation. I had to drink. It was no longer a choice, nor was it fun. The pleasant feelings of confidence and escape that I experienced in the beginning of my using were long gone. I did the majority of my using alone and hated myself more and more. I was a shell of the person I once was. My eyes were cold, and I lost my interest in showing love or affection. Change is exciting when you choose it, but horrible when it's chosen for you. In the early mornings of July 2nd, 2001, before the sun came up, there was a knock on my bedroom door. In a doped haze, I opened the door to find two enormous men hovering over me. My mom and dad were standing behind the two giants, and an eerie sense of fear and sadness filled me. Intuitively, I knew my parents had hired these men to take me to rehab. My parents had tears streaming down their faces, and they hugged, trying to offer each other some sort of solace from their despair. I felt only anger and self-pity. The last thing I said to my parents as the giants took me to their truck was, "Fuck you, you've just lost your son." In the truck, I couldn't allow myself to ask where we were going for the fear that they might think I cared. They handcuffed me to the middle seat after I tried jumping out of the window. They put a yellow sign around my neck with big red lettering, "Minor in Transit," and walked me through the airport. I yelled and I screamed, saying, "They're kidnapping me! Help! Help!" People looked with curiosity and apparently didn't feel the need to come see what was going on once they saw the yellow sign. The escorts later told my parents they had never transported a more destructive teen. 2 hours later, I landed in Utah. The man who met me at the airport told me I was going to a wilderness/boot camp/rehab. The horror of my reality started to hit me, and I exploded into a full-blown panic attack. This was the one time in my life I sincerely considered suicide. The idea of a life without drugs or alcohol was unimaginable. I couldn't fathom a life without them, and I didn't want to. The physical withdrawal from drugs is an extremely painful and uncomfortable process. Trying to withdraw while hiking all day and sleeping on the ground is an experience I never want to experience again. I entered the wilderness weighing a frightening 99 pounds. Hiking about 10 miles per day with an 80-pound backpack made the process seem unbearable. Many times it was the recollection of how miserable I was that kept me from relapse. The phrase, "This is an accident. I was never supposed to end up here," played in my mind on repeat. This time, the reality was all too clear. I didn't have anyone or anything to put the blame on other than me and my actions. The quiet of the wilderness was deafening. The lack of stimuli and the distraction was difficult to cope with. The lack of stimuli and distractions was difficult to cope with. Without them, I had to deal with me. Seeing clearly that I was an addict, and my life was completely run by chasing a high, was undeniable. The only hope for my life to take a turn for the better was to get off drugs and stay sober. And in my acknowledgement of this indisputable reality, the awful quiet became viscerally calming for me. The old pine trees taught me patience, and the abundant sage taught me about effort and consistency. I started meditating every morning and evening. I I would sit between 5 and 10 minutes and get up when I was sufficiently distracted or bored. I also held a belief in God and prayed multiple times a day asking for his or her help in keeping me sober once I got out of the treatment. Since then, my theological beliefs and understanding of religion have changed dramatically, but I must acknowledge that prayer was immensely helpful. It served as a tool to view my mind, actions, and situations from a different perspective, one that was more objective and one that offered just enough space where I could begin to learn how to self-correct. The 3 months I spent in the wilderness gave my brain the opportunity to see the world without a fog of drugs for the first time. I had come to the conclusion that I simply could not touch drugs. I believed that my recovery was going to be contingent upon the spiritual practice and connection. I still had not been introduced to the disease concept of addiction nor the 12 steps, and still felt and thought I was broken, and no one would ever be able to relate to my struggle with addiction. But I had hope for the first time in my life. Once I got home and started outpatient rehab, I was introduced to the 12 steps and was taught about the phenomenon of craving. The idea that I could be aware of my thoughts and feelings, recognize the certain combination of them as cravings, and not confuse them with reality was life-changing. For the first time, I began to observe the mind and was able to choose to believe it or not. I dove into the 12-step program. I attended a meeting every day, had a sponsor, worked the steps, and did my best to be of service. I felt very comfortable within the fellowship of 12-steppers. They had an understanding of the hell we all had gone through and a shared appreciation of the freedom from addiction. Similarly, the inventory process, sharing my fears, sharing my secrets, freed my heart, and I felt released from the death grip of shame and self-hatred. The immense process admitting when I made mistakes and committed to righting these wrongs humbled me. Every morning I felt that I was a full participant in my life and was shaping the person I wanted to be. I spent the first few years of my recovery in the 12-step world. Throughout this time, I had been practicing a meditation that was deeply committed to a spiritual tradition of an Indian guru. After many years of devoted practice, I developed a crisis of faith. I could no longer subscribe to the theological ideas I had been practicing. As I looked into my actions and my beliefs, I only found holes. I denied that grace was bestowed upon me, that some superior being had the ability to, quote, grant me serenity or courage, end quote. I began to see I had a fundamental disagreement with that idea. I constantly heard people say that their sobriety was, quote unquote, a gift, which I viewed increasingly as a cop-out. My spiritual path and practice needed an update. These beliefs and practices served me very well in the beginning of my sobriety, but now it felt like they were holding me back. In shedding the idea of God or influential higher power, I was able to take full responsibility for all the happiness and the suffering in my life. I will forever be grateful to the 12 steps for helping me achieve and maintain sobriety. I also feel an underlying gratitude for the steps as they created the foundation for me to find the Dharma. Sobriety helped me stop creating wreckage. The Dharma gave me tools to achieve levels of contentment and happiness I thought not possible. I rediscovered something I had learned before I got sober, the Four Noble Truths. While so many other religions or spiritual teachings seem to tell me that everything was just the way it's supposed to be, or everything is love, or God works in mysterious ways, the Four Noble Truths recognized life's unsatisfactory nature and openly admitted that there was indeed suffering. This spoke to the depths of my experience. It was refreshingly honest. I remember thinking, finally, a spiritual path that doesn't lie to me. Everything in the Four Noble Truths seemed to have been written specifically for me. It was as if I had known these things all along. I just needed to be reminded of them. There is suffering in this always changing, temporary universe in which we live. The root cause of suffering is greed, hatred, and delusion. I was hooked. I read every Dharma book I could get my hands on. The theoretical framework of how to view the world was as freeing as it was counterintuitive. It was a crazy idea to not hate pain and not grasp for more pleasure. Trying to meet pain with compassion and pleasure and appreciation and knowing that this too shall pass were tall orders. I began practicing mindfulness, just like watching a craving come and go. I applied the tool of observation and investigation to everything. I learned that my heart could be trained, that if I practiced kindness towards myself and others, my experience of life would be happy. I was not asked to take anything on faith. In fact, I was encouraged to put everything under scrutiny. Everything that the Dharma told me was true, and I could verify through my own direct experience if I looked carefully. Through my investigations, I found a new appreciation to leading an ethical life. With increased mindfulness, I was able to see the power of my actions. When I took unethical actions, I created inner turmoil as a direct result. When I took ethical ones, I felt a new freedom that is often referred to as the feeling of blamelessness. As I continued to immerse myself in Dharma, I saw that my motivation for continuing my sobriety had changed. Initially, my decision to stay sober was driven by the fear of falling back into addiction and its inevitable hell. After reading about Dharma, the Four Noble Truths, my decision was no longer fear-based. It was made every day to affirm life. I injected the dope fiend work ethic of always looking for what I can get into my meditation practice. I learned that no matter what, everything and everyone could teach me. Just like a thief was always looking for what he could steal, I began to look for what lessons I could take. The more I practiced embodying compassion and actually believing myself to be worthy of forgiveness and worthy of happiness, the more I saw that there was no need to defend or protect my heart. Being the person I was felt safer and safer. The Buddhist equation to end suffering proved itself to be absolutely true and trustworthy. I have every confidence that the Dharma can be applied to addiction. Today, my mind continues its play date with madness, and by no means am I a saint. The mind's not the problem. However, it's how I relate to it. Nothing about me is broken. I just need to locate and listen to what is asking for healing. My happiness is not dependent on the situation I find myself in, but the quality of my presence. Remembering that love is always the logical, correct response to anything, I let go. Over and over again, my practice is simply to remember that more quickly. That's beautiful. Now to end this, I'm going to go back here and looking for the appendix. Here we go. And I'm going to read what this book has as the Four Noble Truths. So that weekend compassion meditation. Loving kindness meditation, appreciation and joy meditation, forgiveness meditation, format for refuge meetings, mindfulness breathing. And we're going to get all these. I'm going to do separate videos for these. Mindfulness of feeling tone. I've done a couple of them already. If you go scroll back, mindfulness of the mind, mindfulness of the truth, eating meditation, compassion meditation, Tonglen meditation, loving kindness meditation, appreciation, enjoyment meditation. Oh yeah, we're going to get all these separately in different videos. Equanimity meditation. Well, there you go. I could have sworn that they had the Four Noble Truths somewhere. Go to the front. And the Four Truths of Recovery. Well, just as a reminder, addiction creates suffering. First truth is inventory. Write an in-depth and detailed inventory of the suffering you have experienced in association with your addiction. Share the inventory with a trusted friend, a member, or your Buddhist teacher to understand the nature of your addiction/suffering. Cause of addiction is repetitive craving. That's the second truth of the inventory, would be write an in-depth and detailed inventory about the difficulties that you have been trying to avoid. Investigating how craving for more pleasure and less pain led you into addiction. Share the inventory with a trusted friend, a mentor, or a teacher, and come to understand how the cause of your addiction/suffering. And then recovery is possible. Path to recovery. Okay. Well, we have the 8. No, that was not what I was looking for. Oh, here we go. The process. If you're still watching, good for you. Refuge recovery follows the traditional Buddhist system of the Four Noble Truths. Here we go. Which begin with the 4 actions. 1. We take stock of all the suffering we have experienced and caused as addicts. 2. We investigate the causes and conditions that led to addiction and begin the process of letting go. 3. We come to understand that recovery is possible and take refuge in the path that leads to the end of addiction. 4. We engage in the process of the Eightfold path that leads to recovery. The Eightfold path that leads to recovery is 1. Understanding. 2. Your intention. 3. Communication/community. In other words, you have to break out of your bubble and commune with others. 4. Action/engagement. You can't just think about it. You have to put it into action. Number 5. Livelihood/service. What are you doing with your life and how are you serving? 6. Effort/energy. Be responsible for your energy and actually put effort into your life. 7. Mindfulness/meditation. And Katie's like, are you done yet? And so mindfulness/meditation. And 8 is concentration/meditation, which is where all those meditations that I just ranted off a couple of minutes ago will come into play. Namaste, guys. We'll see you hopefully tomorrow, if not the next day. Love you. Good night.